Janiece Johnson is a transplanted Bay Area, California native who loves history, design, art, good food, and traveling. Dr. Johnson has a master's degree in American religious history and theology and a PhD in American history. Taught at BYU, Idaho in religious education and currently teaches and researches at BYU. She's the co-author of many books. I'm not going to read them all. I do know we have her book here in our bookstore, and after she speaks, and someone gets her lunch, so, well, we'll get her lunch. She will be out in the foyer area, and she can sign a copy of her book and talk to her about it at that time. But with that, we're happy to have Dr. Janiece Johnson.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you, Scott. It's good to be with you all today. There we go. Okay, so my book came out in May, so a couple months ago. But I have spent most of my career working on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I, as a master's student at BYU in history, I took a little bit longer on my master's thesis because I switched topics kind of near the end, and had a few extra months before I was headed off to the next stage of graduate school, to divinity school. And I needed a job. And so I interviewed for a job with Ron Walker to be a research assistant. I interviewed, he told me the job was working on Brigham Young and the Indians. That wasn't really in my wheelhouse, and I wasn't particularly interested in it. But I needed a job. And then I had what I thought was going to be a second interview. And in this, it wasn't a second interview at all. He said, "You have the job if you want it, but we're working on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And it's not public yet. It hasn't been publicly announced by the church, so you can't talk about it." This was not quite what I expected, but I still needed a job. So, started working for Ron Walker. At the end of, first they said that it was going to be 4 or 5 months. And I thought, this is perfect, and then I just have a summer before I start school again in the fall. And yet I worked for about 6 or 8 months, 6 months, and we were nowhere near done. They thought with three authors and a whole host of resources at the Church History Library and a whole host of researchers that this would be done very quickly. The book that proceeded from that work was Massacre at Mountain Meadows, and it was not published until 2008. This was 2001 when it began. But as I left, I didn't feel like I was done with Mountain Meadows. And I didn't particularly like working on Mountain Meadows. I was completely nauseated for the first few months that I worked on it. Once it became public, I could talk to people about the project, and many Latter-day Saints that I talked to kind of made me feel like we were going to find out what really happened and why it wasn't so bad. And my response inevitably was, it's just as bad. You can't make this better. But part of my initial reaction as I was first learning was my inability to decipher between what was real and what wasn't, and what was exaggeration and what was built up. The reality of this event is bad enough. We don't need to exaggerate. We don't need to expand the narrative. But as I began, and the years that I have spent since then, after I went to divinity school, I came back and Rick Turley hired me to work on John D. Lee's 2 trials. I became the general editor of the Mountain Meadows Massacre legal papers. And so this has been central to my to my career. It became my dissertation, and this became my dissertation book. But this book, Convicting the Mormons, is all about the massacre, and yet not at all about the massacre. Because, and John D. Lee, this is the other element here. John D. Lee, in all prior histories, was central to what was going on in the massacre narrative. Yet, the more that I got into John D. Lee's trials and the prosecution for the massacre, the more I realized that John D. Lee wasn't actually central to what was going on. He was guilty, he was a participant, but what was going on politically and legally had very little, in many instances, to do with John D. Lee. Just as a disclaimer, I don't know if it's a disclaimer because I just found this out. The same week that my book came out, Family Search handily told me that I was related to John D. Lee. I had no idea. I've been doing this for more than 20 years. I've even forgotten fourth cousin, 5 times removed. So many of us in the room would probably fit in the same category if you have any Mormon stock. But the more that I got into this topic, the more I realized that much of the story that's told about Mountain Meadows in the 19th century and up until today has very little to do with Mountain Meadows itself. But yet, Mountain Meadows would color everything that Americans and many onto the continent, into Europe, would know about Latter-day Saints in the 19th century. This is Harper's Weekly, a journal of civilization. This is August of 1859. This is the first time that Mountain Meadows gets front page attention. This is 2 weeks before Horace Greeley's interview with Brigham Young is also on the front page of Harper's Weekly. So everything that people learn about the Latter-day Saints in the 19th century comes through this lens or is colored by what happened at Mountain Meadows. Today, I know we're right before lunch, and so I want to make sure that if there's any if we're getting a little bit antsy, that we have plenty of visual things to look at. So we're going to walk through some of the visual culture which makes up this American idea of how this narrative is received in the 19th century. This very striking political cartoon is on the front cover of my book. Some of you may have seen it before, from 1882, Mormonism in Utah, the Cave of Despair. So we have women dressed in kind of their traditional dress from many different countries with tags on them. Some of the tags say where they're from. I think there's one woman who's from Norway, but most of them say sealed. So this is perpetuating this idea that Mormons are gathering women from 4 corners of the earth and bringing them to the Cave of Despair. William Jarman, who was a prolific anti-Mormon pamphleteer in Great Britain, stole this same image and just said, "Welcome to hell." This is what this idea of Utah was. The skull marked Utah with 2 very menacing Mormon men in the 2 eyes, and then this literal signpost to the side of Mountain Meadow. Plural marriage, marital practices may or may not be enough to convince people that there is something untoward about the Latter-day Saints. But Mountain Meadows elevates the danger of Latter-day Saints, elevates the danger of Mormons. And I'm going to use Mormons freely through this because this is how most Americans understood. And in my book, I try to distinguish. I use Mormon when we're talking about perception, and Latter-day Saints when we're talking about what actually happened. But Mormons, this elevated the threat of Mormons to a real physical threat. not just people with curious marital practices. But we have this very on-the-nose reminder of Mountain Meadows. Now, my favorite political cartoon, which I wanted to be on the front cover, but my editor said this was a little more complicated than the last one to understand. But we have this, what I call creepy patriarch in the box. He is sprouting out of the tabernacle, which of course, prior to the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple, this is the most well-known Mormon building. The folds of his neck say polygamy, bigamy, adultery, fanaticism, deceit. He has women falling out of his neck, and his elongated polygamous grasp is grasping for more women. So very definitely this critique of polygamy, and polygamy is always the lightning rod. But to the side we have a specific reminder, again, a literal signpost reminding us of Mountain Meadows. Towards the bottom we have newspaper men who are stamping out ignorance and superstition that seems to be protecting the tabernacle. Now, in the process of preparing images for the book, I finally got a high-resolution image version of this image, and for the first time noticed that not only do we have this signpost again, but we actually have literal dead bodies around the signpost, and those dead bodies continue all the way behind the patriarch in the box to the other side. Again, elevating that threat of Mormonism to a real physical threat. And we're going to see this continually consistently in the 19th century. When John D. Lee goes to trial, he has two trials, one in 1875, which was a hung jury. There is not actually anyone at the trial who can testify to Lee killing anyone. Lee was guilty. He was definitely guilty. But they didn't have evidence of his guilt in that first trial, which resulted in a hung jury. But Lee's trial was reported all over the country. If you were in a small town, you knew about John D. Lee's trial. If you were in a big city, there were headlines with John D. Lee's trial. The only comparison in my lifetime that I can compare this with is O.J. Simpson's trial. I came back from a mission and have very vague memories of being in Argentina and hearing something about the white Bronco. And OJ on the run, came back and was a BYU student, and everyone's watching the trial. And we can see that we have newspaper headlines, we have magazine headlines, we have special reports and commemorative issues of magazines that people can buy to commemorate this event. John D. Lee's trial was that for the 19th century. This is Lee and his attorneys for the first trial. But as I began to look at this, my book compares the relationship of the trials and the official prosecution for John D. Lee and its relationship with the popular narrative that continues to spin about Mountain Meadows. And in general, my argument is that though both the trials and the popular narrative have an interdependent relationship. Sometimes elements come up in the popular narrative first and then later show up in the trial. Other times things come up in the trial and then later show up in the popular narrative. But the elements that become fixated on are not actually elements that yield a lot of information about the truth of what happened on the fields on that day of the massacre, or leading up to that horrific massacre. But they actually tell us more about places where Mormons were perceived to conflict with Americanness or civilization. And so this book, unlike other Mountain Meadows books, I am not following the straight narrative of the massacre, but looking at these different ideas, these different places where Mormons breach acceptable standards of Americanness. The first one is ideas about Mormon savagery. Now, early on, Latter-day Saints were often accused of being too inclusive. This image is supposed to be from Jackson County, and we have Joseph Smith preaching. The description talks about that there were a number of free blacks and Native peoples in attendance. This was considered a negative thing in the 19th century, that Latter-day Saints are inclusive and are bringing people in. But from the publication of the Book of Mormon and the elevated position of Native peoples that we can read from the Book of Mormon, though Latter-day Saints are not always living up to that ideal in practice, we have these accusations that Mormons are too inclusive. And one of them that is consistent long before there ever was a Mountain Meadows was this idea of Mormon savagery, or that Mormons and Native peoples were united. These are Mormon allies at Mountain Meadows. That rather than civilization where savagery and is met with opposition, Mormons wanted, and this of course is a caricature of Native peoples in the 19th century, but that Mormons brought in and were allied with the Indians. We get hints of this in Kirtland, when we have descriptions of some of those extreme spiritual events that happen around the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and they are described as that there is Indian warfare or Indian kind of spiritual practices in evidence there. When the saints are in winter quarters, a woman comes to Warren Foote and says, I've heard about the Mormons and the Indians are getting together and they're going to kill all the settlers on the all the white settlers on the frontier. And Warren Foote says, yeah, she's going to be waiting a long time. Warren Foote, that woman was, Warren Foote did not think that was possible. But in 1857, we see that reality. Images of the massacre. In the 19th century, none of these narratives of the massacre, all of them include Native peoples. John D. Lee specifically goes and recruits Paiutes to help. And John D. Lee and Isaac Hate's plan from the very beginning was that they were going to blame it on the Indians. So again, one of those times when we did not live up to our theology. John D. Lee is a farmer to the Indians. They have proselyted to the Paiutes. They have baptized Paiutes, and here they want to blame the massacre on the Paiutes. That is the plan. In much of the literature that talks about the massacre itself, it talks about how Mormons are acting like Indians. After Mountain Meadows, the Mormons are now more savage than the Indians. They are not like the Indians. They haven't just allied themselves like the Indians, but they are now more savage than the Indians. And we get some later accounts which remove the presence of the Paiutes entirely. It is just white Mormons who have dressed themselves up as Native peoples. All of this rotates around an idea of white civilization. Civilization in the 19th century, it wasn't yet a given that the United States would go from sea to shining sea. Those ideas of manifest destiny are still being inculcated. And this idea of civilization was always inherently white. If you were a white, there was a place for you in American civilization. If you were not, there was not. Now, Mormons, Spencer Fluman talks about the vexed whiteness of the Mormons. Paul Reeves' work does a lot to help us unpack and think about the ways that Mormons were considered not white. However, interestingly, in the Mountain Meadows narrative, it functions very differently. In the Mountain Meadows narrative, Mormons looked white, but then their behavior did not match up. William Carey, who is the lead attorney, the lead U.S. attorney who is prosecuting John D. Lee, when he opens his court case, he talks about two flags. He talks about a white flag, which is known amongst all nations, and he talks about an American flag. Now, every other account will talk about a white flag. When the Mormons go up and John D. Lee tries to get the immigrants to give themselves up after they've been under siege for many days, he has a white flag, and they are duplicitously trying to come under that white flag of truce. And lead, I think this is a direct quote from the trial transcripts, but lead those immigrants cruelly away to their death. But as William Carey is presenting this for the court, he also talks about that they have an American flag. This is the only place we get it. We don't actually have any witnesses. We don't have anyone else who mentions them having an American flag. I don't think they had an American flag. But that is the way he wants to set it up. They're presenting themselves as Americans. They have white skin. They look like they belong, yet they're not. That white skin shields something horrific and duplicitous. Now, today we still get some of the remnants of this. Katie Lofton at the Mormon History Association a couple years ago talked about the Mormon smile, that there is something sinister, duplicitous, hidden behind all these smiling Mormons. But we get precursors to that kind of idea here. Mormons look white, they look like they belong, in contrast to those people of color whose skin signals to us that they do not belong. But yet Mormons aren't part of civilization. They have escaped civilization. Now, much of what we get, we have lots of similarities with the anti-Catholicism that is happening at the same time. Both the Mormons and the Roman Catholics are attacking the foundations of liberty. These foreign reptiles, as Thomas Nast calls them in this famous political cartoon. But this idea of civilization is a very powerful idea. Here we have John Nash's depiction of Columbia bringing, this symbol, this feminized symbol of America, bringing light to a dark frontier. If you noticed, she has a telegraph cable in her hands, and the railroad is following closely behind, and we have wagons bringing light to a dark frontier. Now, Latter-day Saints, where would we put ourselves? We've just had, if you're in Utah, we've just had Days of 47 celebration. Where would Latter-day Saints place themselves on this? Smack dab in the middle, right? In those wagons, bringing light to a dark frontier. Yet most Americans would see this image and would say, no, the Mormons are ahead. The Mormons tried to escape to the darkness. The Mormons are on the edge with the native peoples. They have tried to escape the light of civilization. And their Mormonism has taken that civilization out of them. Gender ideals. Also, Jacob Borman, who is the attorney, the federal district court judge who presides over John D. Lee's 2 trials, as he instructs the jury, he says, I want you to be men. There is this assumption that one could not be Mormon and be an American man. Now, gender ideals in the 19th century as well as gender ideals today are very slippery. What one person could do could be considered manly, and a different person doing something very similar could be considered unmanly. Then just like today. But think about those two political cartoons we looked at the beginning and how this depicts Mormon men. And the narrative of both polygamy and then reinforced with the Mountain Meadows narrative shows us that Mormons men are not manly. They are not true American men. We actually have in the closing arguments given by Robert Baskin, who is the assistant U.S. attorney, he says, Mormon men give up their manhood when they enter the temple and pledge their allegiance to another man, a man they call prophet. That it was impossible for someone to be both Mormon and an American man. And with this, many of these images of the massacre are highly gendered. So we have lots of focus, of course, on women and children and the killing of women and children. There are two girls who show up in the trial testimony, and those two girls become a central role in many different retellings of the massacre. But we also have this idea that not only are Mormon men not protecting women and children, but they are also making women act as men. In this instance, this is one of the immigrant women. Because Mormon men have killed her husband, then she has to be the one to defend her family. She is I think she's called the Tigress, but defending her family against these despicable Mormon men. And then we have themes of despotism and theocracy. Mountain Meadows, the story of Mountain Meadows really becomes like a Leatherman knife. It becomes a multi-use tool. Whatever your concern is about the Mormons, Mountain Meadows will offer you something to demonstrate that Mormons don't belong. And one of the greatest success, I would argue, of John D. Lee's first trial was actually pinning the massacre on Brigham Young. Robert Baskin, one of the U.S. attorneys, they do not, they don't mention Brigham Young's name, only very infrequently. They talk about leaders quite a bit and talk about that they're going to be able to trace responsibility for the massacre to where it belongs. Now, knowing what they're talking about local leaders. And there is certainly guilt there. The massacre would not have happened were it not for Isaac Haight, were it not for him pushing around the consensus of the council, both in Cedar City and then in Parowan. But the way that the U.S. attorneys frame this is that they leave it open, and newspapers take it and run. And very quickly, whereas pre-John D. Lee's first trial, pre-1875, we have a couple people making very quick, kind of minor mentions. Maybe Brigham Young is involved, and then nothing happens because there's nothing to connect Brigham Young to the massacre. After John D. Lee's first trial, Brigham Young is now responsible for the massacre. Brigham Young ordered the massacre. In Robert Baskin's closing trial argument, he will actually say that Brigham Young received a revelation that the massacre that this group of immigrants should be slaughtered through a revelation. And the source of his information about this revelation is, oh gosh, I don't know what just happened, is C.V. Waite's 1866 anti-polygamy book, The Mormon Prophet and His Harem. She is the first person to suggest that Brigham Young receives a revelation. And this ultimately becomes part of the narrative. Now, I'm going to try and go back to there we are, with Brigham Young. John D. Lee, in the last months of his life, is writing his confessions. He is in indigent circumstances. He is, his attorney, William Bishop, has been trying to encourage him to write down his life because Bishop wants to sell it. We have multiple people who, Jacob Borman, who is the trial attorney, wants to sell a transcript of the trials. He thinks he can make money on it. Frederick Lockley, who is the Tribune reporter who was there at both of John D. Lee's trials, actually writes a swashbuckling romance that rotates around the Mountain Meadows that he also thinks he can sell. But William Bishop selling John D. Lee's confessions is the most profitable source, but he needs it to be more sensational than it is. And you'll have to go to the book to actually look at some of the analysis of John D. Lee's confessions. But it's very clear today that this is not just John D. Lee. The Ogden Standard, when John D. Lee's confessions came out, called it a little Lee and a little lawyer. It is highly edited by William Bishop to be more sensationalized. And then I'm just going to show a few of these images, but I want you to notice what kind of picture this is of John D. Lee. This is shortly before his execution. He is at Fort Cameron where he's been held. But this is a cabinet card. Cabinet cards were collector's items. This becomes part of this popular culture. This is John D. Lee. Actually, he is on the left side, sitting on his coffin. This is just prior to his execution. Again, this is sold as a cabinet card. We have an actual image of John D. Lee after 5 bullets ripped through his body, and he in his coffin. We have a special supplement issue of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. So they couldn't yet reproduce photographs, but they can engrave them and produce special issues so that everyone can see them. So you can either buy the cabinet card or you can buy the special supplement issue. Here is a live action shot of John D. Lee falling down into his casket. Like he is standing in front of his casket, the bullets hit him, and he just naturally falls right into the coffin. And these images continue. The last thing to talk about is just in the last part of the 19th century, early 20th century, fiction becomes a huge foray for Mountain Meadows narratives. Very few of them are based in more than just very generically in the facts. Abraham Gash, who was appointed a U.S. attorney in Utah who had nothing to do with John D. Lee's case, but writes a novel after statehood because he's still concerned about the Mormons. Harry Wilson, another who has worked with Bancroft on his history of Utah, writes a novel that rotates around Mountain Meadows. When Reed Smoot is set up to try and question whether or not he can go to Congress, Mountain Meadows doesn't come up until we get to the very last dying breath of this effort. In 1907, we have a Tennessee senator who brings up Mountain Meadows. Kathleen Flake, historian of those Reed Smoot hearings, says it didn't really affect the hearings. However, each night, the senators could go see a Wild West show that retold the story of Mountain Meadows. We had a brand new edition of John D. Lee's Confessions, which again, and though the narrative of civilization that focused these stories in the 19th century has changed quite a bit today. The epilogue of my book goes to present day. I actually watched the last episode of Under the Banner of Heaven and had to write a couple paragraphs and sent off my manuscript. But though the grammar of civilization has changed, many of these elements and these themes that we see throughout the 19th century and early 20th century continue today. And that idea that behind that friendly exterior is something nefarious and something duplicitous stays with us. That Mormon men are dangerous. We are still living with some of the elements of this narrative, though much has changed in the world since 1857 when these stories began being told. I think that I will stop there. Thank you very much. Great. Okay. Oh, it's on.
Yeah.
Good.
Here's your payment for.
Thank you.
So it's interesting hearing about this. I mean, I know these are tall, aren't they? So I grew up in my home with a copy of the Confessions of John D. Lee on our shelf, and we had a member of our ward who actually had someone at school who suddenly showed up at church, and I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I'm a Lee," and now the church is dealing with the Lee family, and so we decided to come back, which I thought was interesting because that was in the 70s. So, have you come across any of the accusations that Brigham Young had anything to do with ordering the massacre? Some critics claim this was somehow connected to the vow some people made to avenge Joseph Smith's blood. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so there is no contemporary evidence of that. We have lots of the Tribune. If you don't like the Salt Lake Tribune right now, I actually really like the Salt Lake Tribune, but in the 1870s, it was a very different animal. And in the 1870s, you've got all sorts of kind of accusations, but they are, and all of the accusations of Mormonism are kind of swirled together. But there was not evidence in 1875 or in 1857 that Brigham Young ordered it. Will Bagley wrote his book, Blood of the Prophets, which was published in 2002. And he was certain that Brigham Young ordered the massacre. He believed that Brigham Young, meeting with Native leaders from southern Utah on the 1st of September, was the smoking gun that he told them to go inexplicably to go and pick out this immigrant train and to slaughter them. But Massacre at Mountain Meadows demonstrated that the earliest that any of those Native leaders left Salt Lake was September 8th, and that that's not enough time to get back to southern Utah, to make those 300 miles to southern Utah by the 11th, and B, the massacre had actually already, the lead up to the massacre was already underway by September 8th. So to put credence in those assumptions, you have to, there's not the information that there is today. To get a runner to Brigham Young takes 3 days. If you've got multiple horses to ride flat out to get to Salt Lake, it's going to take 36 hours to get there. And so you have to believe in all sorts of conspiracies to make that an actual thing. But I think that this tells us something about just how effective fake news is. Because the narrative shifts in the first trial. And by the time, so John D. Lee's first trial is in 1875. By the time that Brigham Young dies in 1877, almost two years and a month later, the narrative has shifted, and half of, not every obituary of Brigham Young, but at least half of the obituaries of Brigham Young include that he ordered the Mountain Meadows Massacre. That in those 2 years, that narrative shifts entirely, and we still have that narrative today.
Totally without evidence.
And Robert Baskin, who is arguing that, I mean, his closing argument is a ridiculous 6-hour diatribe against Brigham Young. But later on, when he becomes friendly again with the Latter-day Saints, he'll say, yeah, we didn't have any evidence that would tie Brigham Young to it. But he was very persuasive, and his arguments were very effective.
Interesting. So here's a question. You mention accounts that claim no Paiutes were present, but Mormons dressed as Indians. Is that credible? There were no Paiutes involved? Or?
So all of the historical accounts that we have include Paiute involvement. The number of Paiutes involved differs from maybe 50 to like 300. There is a strain of Paiute oral history that says that they were not involved. And which is not surprising to me, because if you grew up in Utah and read a Utah textbook, it's blamed it on the Paiutes for 150 years. And so I understand that, but the contemporary sources, none of them contest Paiute presence.
Okay.
Though there's no effort to specifically prosecute the Paiutes. There's one subpoena that is issued, but they never seem to follow up on it.
Okay. So any comment about the non-Mormon Mountain Meadows Monument in Harrison, Arkansas?
No.
Okay. Who was overall responsible for the decision to enact the Mountain Meadows Massacre?
Well,
these are hard questions. I know these are hard.
Yes, it is. There are always many questions about the massacre. The massacre would not have happened without Isaac Haight. I won't go any further than that. I've already mentioned it a little bit. But every time it went before a council, the council shot it down and said, no, we're not doing this. But Isaac Haight circumvented the council on 2 different occasions. And without that circumnavigation of the councils, the massacre would not have happened.
Okay, and your last question we have here says not to excuse the massacre, but to address motive. Why was this particular group of travelers targeted?
It's a perfect
storm.
It's a perfect storm. I have a hard time using the word perfect but you have the timing, you have the tension, that they know that the federal army is marching. They're in southern Utah. You have some very caustic personalities. You have a lack of information. You have all of these things coming together in the most horrific way possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I have critics say, FAIR is here just to put the best light on everything, and yet we talk about things like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which there really isn't a good light to shine on. It's just...
There's no good light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So her book is for sale in our bookstore. I'm sure she'd be happy to sign a copy for you. And thank you very much.